All right. All right. So, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Yiran Liu. I'm a PhD candidate in epidemiology at Stanford. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some of our recent modeling work with you all. So, as you all know, the global decline in TB incidence here in the dark blue line has been slow and far short of TB elimination targets, including the 2025 milestone. Nonetheless, that decline has been the result of hard won, except the region of the Americas, where TB incidence has actually stalled since about the year 2010, and has in fact increased in recent years, even prior to the health system disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this really underscores the need to identify key TB drivers in this region in particular. Now, most of the TB burden in the region of the Americas is coming from Latin America, which also has the world's fastest growing prison population. So since about the year 2000, the prison population has increased by over 150%. And that increase really towers above the rate of change in all other regions of the world. Now, most of that increase is accounted for by the two largest countries in the region, Brazil and Mexico. But we can also plot every country on a log 10 scale on the y-axis and see that increasing trend is really constant across nearly every country in the region. And I'll also just point out that this increasing trend outpaces simple population growth. So we also see a steady increase in the per capita rate of incarceration. Excuse me. And now, we've known for a long time that prisons are high-risk settings for infectious disease transmission. And part of that is because of their overcrowded nature. And so here on the upper right, we have percent occupancy on the x-axis. And you can see that in most countries in the region, prisons are holding far more people than they were designed to hold. And now, arguably, no one should be subjected to these inhumane conditions, but it is important to note that many of the people in prison also have never been convicted of a crime. So the percent of people detained pre-trial will vary across countries, but is considerable in every country. And this has really had dire consequences for TB. In a meta-analysis that our colleagues did a couple of years ago, they found that globally, prisons are high-risk settings for TB, with the risk of TB being about 10 times as high in prisons as outside prisons, or as in the general population. And that disparity differs across regions of the world. But you can see again here, South America is an outlier with an incidence rate ratio of about 27 for TB in prisons versus in the general population. Now, following that meta-analysis, colleagues also published a paper where they partnered with PAHO to collect and analyze TB notifications that were occurring in prisons versus outside prisons. And they found that essentially in almost all countries, any decline in TB notifications outside prison was partially or completely offset by a rise in TB notifications in prison. And what this meant was that the proportion of all TB notifications in each country that were occurring in the country's prisons was increasing over time. Essentially, TB was increasingly concentrated in prisons over time in almost every country in Central and South America, as shown here. Now in 2017, that kind of crude population attributable fraction, if you will, was about 11%, which is already starkly high. And yet, we have reason to believe that notified cases in prisons really are an underestimate of the true burden of TB that's attributable to incarceration for many reasons. So one of those reasons is under-detection in prisons. This recent paper on the global, regional, and national incidence of TB in prisons estimates that the case detection ratio globally is about 53% in prisons, compared to about 80% in the general population. So there is that disparity in case detection. And second, what's really important to note about incarceration is that unlike some other risk factors, for example, HIV or diabetes, incarceration is a really dynamic risk factor. Most people who are in prison will be released within a couple of years. And yet the exposure to that high-risk setting during incarceration, that can kind of embed a risk that persists even as individuals leave prison. So this figure here is from a data linkage study done in Brazil, where they found by linking person-level incarceration data with the TB notifications database, that the rate of TB notifications was elevated in the early years following release from prison, shown here in the blue line. For reference, the kind of baseline or general population notification rate in Brazil is around 40 per 100,000 for that period. So you can see it kind of remained elevated for at least 7 years following release from prison. And as of now, most countries in the region, and I believe globally, don't record any information on history of incarceration in their case notifications databases. And so all of these notifications would not currently be considered as being related to prisons or related to incarceration. And then finally, we know, that from several genomic epidemiologic studies that have been conducted within Latin American countries, as well as in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, that the genomic strains of TB isolated from patients with and without incarceration history are highly related. So certainly there's the risk of onward transmission following outbreaks that occur in prisons. All right, so we really set out to understand the true impact of mass incarceration on the broader population-wide TB epidemic in Latin America, accounting for all of these factors that prior studies that have focused on notifications in prisons or even on TB occurring within prisons have kind of overlooked. And we had two specific aims that we set out to answer or examine. The first was to quantify the excess population level TB burden that can be attributed specifically to the rise in incarceration prevalence since 1990. And then the second aim was to look forward and estimate the effects of incarceration policy alternative population TB incidence in the future. So we chose to focus on 6 epidemiologically diverse countries in the region. We did our best to get geographic heterogeneity as well as epidemiologic heterogeneity. So in particular, we were looking for kind of representativeness across the main dimensions of our analysis. The first being kind of the prevalence of incarceration over time, as well as in present day, and the burden of TB in the general population, as well as in prisons specifically. And you can see that across the 6 countries that we included in this analysis, we have quite a good range for all of 3 of these indicators. And we also actually were able to account for the majority of the prison population and the burden of TB in the general population and in prisons in the entire region. So across these 6 countries, we're covering over 80% of the prison population and the TB burden. All right, so I'm going to start getting into some technical details here. And feel free to, if anyone's not interested in this, feel free to tune out and I'll call you back when we get to the results. But for all the modelers out there, I will share a little bit more technical detail. So we used a deterministic compartmental transmission model, a meta-population model, actually. And I'll start by kind of explaining the TB dimension of the model. We essentially used a very simple representation of TB natural history, wherein upon contact with infectious individuals, susceptible individuals develop early latent infection, and they can then progress rapidly to active infectious TB disease. Or alternatively, they can transition to a late latent state where now the risk of progression or the rate of progression to active disease is lower. Individuals who have disease can recover through diagnosis and treatment, which we assume is spontaneous, or through self-cure. And we also account for the possibility of relapse or reinfection among those with latent infection or previously treated TB. All right, so now I'll explain the meta-population dimension of this model, starting at the bottom here. So these, the population strata will be in rows, and individuals are born into our model at age 15 with no history of incarceration. And they can then traverse these strata to become incarcerated and subsequently be released from prison into this stratum, which we call recent history of incarceration. Now, in this strata of recent incarceration history, we assume that the risk of TB and reincarceration and mortality are higher than in the strata with distant incarceration history or no incarceration history. Now, if individuals remain out of prison, they can then transition from the recent to distant incarceration history stratum. And we assume in this distant incarceration history stratum, everything kind of epidemiologically is the same as in never incarcerated. The reason why we still maintain this stratum is so that we can kind of keep track in a model without kind of history, and we can still keep track of individuals who've ever been exposed to incarceration. Okay, so then we essentially replicate the 5 TB natural history compartments across these 4 population strata to get the model that we have here. All right, so to calibrate the model, we calibrated the model independently for each of the 6 countries in our analysis. And we did a 2-step calibration process where we started first by calibrating the incarceration-related parameters using incarceration-related data targets. And for this step, we actually used a separate kind of simpler transition model, population transition model, that was co-developed by me and an undergraduate student at Stanford who I've been fortunate to work with, Yasmin Meben. And I'll note that this population transition model additionally distinguished, it had the same 4 population strata that I showed you previously, except that it additionally distinguished between those in prison who were there for the first time or who were there for a repeat incarceration. And that was so that we could fit to some of our data targets, as I will now describe. So for our calibration targets for this transition model, we use the prevalence of incarceration, which is basically the proportion of the population that's in prison at any given point in time. We also had data for all countries from varying years on the number of people entering prison each year. And this gave us a sense of not only the stock, but also the flow and the kind of rate of population turnover for the prison population. And then in addition to that, one additional dynamic that we accounted for was, as I mentioned, this kind of reincarceration versus first-time incarceration. And for that, we had data on the proportion of the prison population that had a prior incarceration history. So using these data targets, we were then able to calibrate the rates of entry into prison, both for those who had never been incarcerated, as well as for those who had a history of incarceration. And then we also were able to calibrate the release rate. And because the nature of our analysis was kind of over a period of time from 1990 to present day, in order to account for and fit to changes in each of these targets over time, what we did was we calibrated a baseline value for 1990, as well as rates of change. And these were typically kind of linear rates of change per year for each of these other parameters. All right, so just to give you a sense, before I go on to the second step of calibration, just to give you a sense of some of the variability across countries in the incarceration dynamics that can't simply be accounted for by looking at the prevalence of current incarceration. I'll start with the prevalence of current incarceration in the top row, which you can see varies between 216 in Mexico to 825 in El Salvador. This is per 100,000 population among the population age 15 and older. And the current incarceration prevalence is the result of an increase since 1990, which also ranges from a low of 39% increase in Mexico to an over 400% increase in Brazil. And you can see that in all countries except Mexico, this increase was actually greater than 100%. So the rate more than doubled. Next, essentially, one thing that I may not have clarified yet is that we see the prevalence of incarceration, and as that increases over time, that increase can be due to either an increasing rate of inflows, so increasing entry rates, or it can be due to a decreasing rate of outflows, or to put it another way, an increasing average duration in prison. And we were able to use data on entries and releases that we collected from each of these countries to inform our assumptions here about whether mass incarceration or the rise in incarceration prevalence in each of these countries was driven largely by an increasing rate of entry into prison and or an increasing duration of incarceration. All right, so aside from that, we also had heterogeneity in the average duration of incarceration. These are the median estimates for the year 2019. And you can see that in Brazil, that average duration ranges is about 1.3 years, but then it goes all the way up to about 6 years in El Salvador and Peru. And one of the other data targets that we had was the prevalence of incarceration history within prison, which also varied from about 17% in El Salvador to 51% in Brazil. And these two kind of last characteristics here really contributed to a lot of the dynamics and the turnover rates in prison across the different strata, and contributed to the variability that we see then in the prevalence of incarceration history outside of prison. So we can see that in a country like Mexico, for example, where we have a relatively shorter average duration of incarceration, as well as a lower percent or lower prevalence of incarceration history within prison, we have quite a larger community prevalence of incarceration history, because we're getting a lot of new individuals being newly incarcerated and flowing through the prison system rather quickly compared to other countries. All right. Okay, so now I'll go on to our second step of model calibration, where we calibrated. So from the first step, I forgot to say that from the first step, we burned in the incarceration-related parameters that were calibrated from that first step. And then we then proceeded to go to our main model, including TB, and calibrate the TB-related parameters there. So for this calibration step, our targets included the notification rate and the estimates of incidence rate, both in prisons as well as in the entire population at large over time. And the parameters that we calibrated were the effective contact rates, the rates of fast progression from early latent to infectious TB, and the diagnosis rates. And we calibrated these separately for the different strata, which I'll describe a little bit more in the next slide. And again, for these, we calibrated both a baseline value and a rate of change in order to fit to many of the temporal trends that we saw in TB burden, both in the entire population as well as within prisons. And for all of our, in order to kind of better account for a lot of uncertainty in both the data that we were using for calibration, as well as the other parameters that we didn't calibrate, we sampled from wide uncertainty distributions and ended up with over 1,000 fitted parameter sets, or 1,000 sets of sampled targets, sampled non-calibrated parameters, and fitted parameter sets for every country. Okay, so this is the last method slide, but I'll just highlight some key assumptions that we made. And I definitely haven't been able to talk through all of the complexities, so I'm happy to answer more questions about any of these or other questions you may have. So some key assumptions we made. We assumed that the elevated risk of TB in prisons was the result of a higher effective contact rate in prisons compared to outside prisons, as well as a higher rate of rapid progression to disease and a lower rate of diagnosis than outside prison.
Good morning.
We also, as I alluded to earlier,
Good morning.
operationalized a higher risk of TB in the stratum with recent incarceration history. So we accomplished that by assuming an elevated progression rate as well as a lower diagnosis rate. And actually, in order to operationalize these, we had little to no data to actually fit to for this subpopulation in particular. So what we did was we sampled weights for each of these from a uniform distribution bounded by the levels of progression rates in prison versus among those with no incarceration history, and same for diagnosis rates. And so basically we had across all of our parameter sets, progression rates in the recent incarceration history strata that varied all the way from the rates in prison to the rates among those with no prior exposure to incarceration. For effective contact rates, we did assume that those were equal across all groups outside of prison, all population strata outside of prison. And we also assumed proportionate mixing among all groups outside of prison, but we did vary that in a sensitivity analysis, which I'll get to later. Okay, and then, I already mentioned that we had kind of changes over time and parameters in order to fit to changes over time that we saw in the data. So the way that we achieved this was outside prisons. In most countries, we saw a decline in TB burden over the last 30 years outside prisons, or in the general population rather. And so in order to achieve that, we assumed that the effective contact rate and progression rate decreased over time, and the diagnosis rate increased over time. Now this smaller red arrow here for the effective contact rate is for two countries, Argentina and Mexico, in which the estimated incidence in the entire population has actually been steadily increasing, albeit slowly, since about the year 2010. So we also assumed that was due to kind of a slight reversal of the historical decline in effective contact rates. And then within prisons, if you remember, in most of these countries, the notification rate in prisons was increasing in recent years. And so to account for that, we assumed that the effective contact rate within prisons was increasing. Again, there's always exceptions, and in a few countries, incarceration prevalence has actually decreased in recent years, and so we also allowed for that to decrease as countries have decarcerated in recent years. We assumed that progression rates in prisons remained equal over the entire period, based on reasoning that kind of the underlying risk of these individuals who are incarcerated likely is not changing over time. And then we did increase the diagnosis rate in prison, but at a lower rate than the diagnosis rate outside prison improved. All right. So we're at the end of the methods, the kind of the weeds of the methods. So if anyone has tuned out and wants to come back, please do. So I'll first describe the results from our first aim, which is to, again, quantify the excess population level TB burden attributable to the rise in incarceration prevalence since 1990. So first, I'll orient you to our two scenarios that made up the bulk of this analysis. So here we have every country in a facet. We have year on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the prevalence of incarceration per 100,000 population. And the dots in each plot represent the data on incarceration prevalence over time. And the dark gray blue line is our model fit to the observed data. Now, after fitting the over 1,000 parameter sets to these data, we then simulated a counterfactual incarceration scenario where we essentially turned off all changes in entry rates and release rates. And that enabled incarceration prevalence to remain constant from 1990 to present day. And before I go on, I'll just make a quick note that for these analyses, we analyzed the period of 1990 to 2019 to kind of avoid some of the uncertainties during the COVID pandemic. We did look at the results for the year 2022 based on the changes from the pandemic that we modeled, and they weren't substantially different, but I'm happy to talk more about that later. All right, so now with these, with the observed mass incarceration scenario and the counterfactual scenario, we then looked at TB incidence at the population level under each of those scenarios. So here, again, we have time on the x-axis, and now we have the rate or the incidence rate of TB at the population level on the y-axis. Here I'm just showing you Brazil for simplicity, but again, the dots represent the data that we fit to for our observed scenario. And then the orange line here represents the predicted TB incidence in Brazil if incarceration prevalence had remained constant since 1990. And we can then take the difference between in TB incidence between these two scenarios, and we will then call that the excess population TB incidence that's attributable to the rise in incarceration since 1990. And we can plot just that difference. So now, assuming this orange line is at 0 here, we can plot just this excess in each country over time, which we can see varies in terms of magnitude, as indicated by the different y-axis scales here, but nonetheless kind of increases in concordance with the rise in incarceration in each country over time. And just to give you a sense of kind of the numbers here for a more recent estimate from 2019, here I'm in the first column here, I'm showing you the incidence rate ratio. And what that means is basically the rate of the population level TB incidence in the observed scenario compared to that expected under the counterfactual incarceration scenario. And we can see that kind of the excess, relative excess, ranges from about 5% in Argentina and Mexico to about 133% in El Salvador in 2019. This then translates to a different kind of more burden, per capita burden in each country, which is largely based on the TB burden in the general population in each country. And that ranges from about one case per 100,000 in Mexico to about 32.5 cases per 100,000 in El Salvador. And then we can also calculate or estimate how that translates in the absolute scale of absolute excess cases. We estimate that in 2019 alone, about over 30,000 incident TB cases could be attributed to the rise in incarceration prevalence since 1990. So next, we wanted to ask where these excess incident cases are occurring. And so here, the kind of upper black line on each of these facets is what I've already shown you on a previous slide in terms of the total excess burden attributable to mass incarceration. But now we've filled in these plots with the subgroup or the location where disease is progressing and occurring. So we can kind of go through these colors one by one. The darkest purple color at the bottom here represents the fraction of the excess cases that occur within prison and, according to our model, are notified during incarceration. The next color then represents those cases that progress to disease within prison but remain undetected during incarceration. So these excess cases will persist as individuals are leaving prison, and they'll remain infectious as they leave prison. The next lighter color after that are cases occurring among those with a history of incarceration. You can see that in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, that makes up over a third of all excess cases. This is disease that's actually progressing outside of prison due to prison-acquired infections. And then the last light yellow color, which only really shows up here for two countries, Colombia and Mexico, are kind of the result of onward transmission to individuals without any incarceration history. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in the distribution of excess cases in each country. And I'll just remind you that this can be largely explained by the heterogeneity in incarceration dynamics across countries. So for example, in El Salvador and Peru, if you remember, those two countries had the longest average duration of incarceration. And that's likely why our model predicts that most of the cases most of prison-acquired infections will actually progress to disease during incarceration, while individuals are still in prison, even though they're not, even though a fraction of them may not be diagnosed until after this. And then, alternatively in Mexico, where we have a really high community prevalence of incarceration history, that likely leads to this kind of larger effect, spillover effect, to people who've never been incarcerated, because the prevalence of this elevated risk due to incarceration is larger in the community in Mexico. All right, so next, we quantified or estimated the population attributable fraction for incarceration using an alternative scenario where we actually reduced incarceration prevalence to 0 gradually from the year 1990 to the year 2019. And now here I'm showing you in red the percent of all incident cases that we estimate are attributable to incarceration at large in each of these countries. And we're comparing these now, we're putting them in context of the estimates for the population attributable fractions for other key risk factors that are routinely tracked and surveilled by the WHO. So these other estimates come from the WHO Global TB report. And you can see that our estimates of the path for incarceration, in many countries exceed, or at least are commensurate with the paths for all other major risk factors that currently have received far greater attention than incarceration. And I'll also point out, so, this whole bar represents our estimated path, but the darker red color here represents the crude path estimate if you were to only look at the percent of all notified cases that occur in prisons. And this really highlights the extent to which we've currently been underestimating the burden of TB attributable to incarceration. All right, so we performed a number of sensitivity analyses, and I won't show you the results, but again, I'm happy to talk more about these. The first thing was we assumed assortative mixing among the strata outside prison. We assumed that individuals with incarceration history, that the relative amount of intergroup mixing among people with incarceration history was 3 times higher than under the proportionate mixing assumption. We also tried varying, as I mentioned previously, the disease progression rates and the diagnosis rates in the stratum with recent incarceration history due to a lot of uncertainty about that subgroup. And even comparing kind of the upper and lower quartiles for each of these, we didn't see a huge difference. And then finally, we, as I mentioned, we had assumed that the effective contact rate within prison had increased in some of these countries over time in order to fit to data that showed increasing notification rates in prison. We tried a sensitivity analysis where we eliminated those changes. I'll note that for El Salvador, we were not able to get any good fits to the data under this assumption for this sensitivity analysis. But for the other countries, we did. But nonetheless, for each of these sensitivity analyses, we saw trivial differences, less than 3% differences in the relative excess burden in 2019 attributable to incarceration across all countries. Okay, so now we'll talk about the second aim, which is to estimate the effects of incarceration policy alternatives on future population TB incidence. So I'll start by orienting you to the different future incarceration scenarios that we simulated with showing Peru here as an example. So we had a 10-year intervention period starting from 2024. And our reference or base case scenario was this black scenario in the black line here, which we call stable. And for this, we basically held entry and release rates for entry into prison and release from prison constant over the 10-year intervention period. We then had a continuing trend scenario where we essentially assumed the same relative change in prison entry and release rates over the intervention period as we saw over the prior 10 years. And then finally, we simulated a number of decarceration scenarios where a reduction in incarceration prevalence was achieved by either reducing entry rates and or increasing release rates. And for each of these, we implemented linear changes over time in order to reach kind of a goal of 25% or 50% by the end of the period, by 2034. So you can see that in Peru, these decarceration scenarios result in overall decrease in incarceration prevalence. But notably, for Peru as well as in other countries, here this horizontal dotted line represents the incarceration prevalence from 1990. So you can see that even with the kind of most aggressive decarceration scenario, so to speak, we're not close to the incarceration prevalence from 1990. Okay, so now after simulating these scenarios, we looked at the effect on population TB incidence at the end of the period in 2034. And what these box plots are showing on the x-axis here is the percent difference in population TB incidence in 2034 relative to that expected in the stable incarceration scenario. So you can see that, in these countries, depending on whether in the prior 10 years incarceration prevalence has been increasing or not, continuing trends is either bad or not so bad for TB. But then you can see a reduction in population TB incidence in 10 years for all of the decarceration scenarios. And notably for if we reduce entries by 50% and increase releases by 50%, we're able to achieve more than a 10% reduction in population TB incidence in 3 of these countries, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru, which actually are 3 of the 4 countries with the largest TB burden in the region. Now, for those of you who are paying really close attention, you may have noticed that El Salvador is missing from this figure. And that's because we are in a really dire state of emergency in El Salvador, where since March 2022, the country has been under an extended state of emergency or state regime of exception. And the government has really cracked down on gangs in an unprecedented way. And the incarcerated population is thought to have nearly tripled within the span of a year. To account for this, they built a massive massive prison to hold 40,000 people. You can see by the stats here that the the space allotted to each person is way lower than the international human rights standard. And this is if they do not exceed capacity as they have for all other prisons that they've built. Human rights organizations have documented massive human rights violations, including arbitrary detentions, torture, kidnapping, and a lot of opacity and covering up of deaths occurring in prisons. And the future of the country and the prison population is quite uncertain. The president, Kelly, was just reelected last month in a landslide victory. He's very popular for these tough on crime policies. And so the future of El Salvador does look quite bleak, but it's certainly very uncertain. As a result, we kind of analyzed El Salvador a little bit separately from the other 5 countries for our future scenarios. We use data that's been reported by the Ministry of Justice to simulate the state of emergency to date. You can see here that we estimate, the data actually show that over 2% of the population above age 15 is currently incarcerated. But we for El Salvador, we simulate scenarios where either the state of emergency continues, where it kind of gradually fades over time, or alternatively, where we kind of promptly and actively cease the state of emergency and revert incarceration prevalence to its approximate level from before the state of emergency, either within 10 years or more quickly within 5 years or 2 years. And first, I'll just point out that we predict that if the state of emergency continues, we expect over 125% increase in population TB incidence by 2034 compared to pre-state of emergency. Alternatively, if we are to promptly cease the state of emergency and restore incarceration prevalence within 10 years, we can also restore population TB incidence to its pre-emergency level. And then, obviously, if we revert faster, we can also partially make up for the years of lost opportunity in TB progress in the region or in the country. Okay, so I'll just end with some limitations and conclusions. Obviously, our deterministic compartmental model is highly simplistic and can't nearly replicate the real world complexity. And in particular, we didn't explicitly model age, gender, socioeconomic status, HIV, drug resistance, or other heterogeneities like heterogeneity in infectiousness or heterogeneity in duration of incarceration. Additionally, and this was largely due to us having limited data to actually calibrate the model and inform assumptions with all of these complexities. Nonetheless, we did have wide parameter uncertainty distributions, and we had a number of sensitivity analyses, and we did find that our results were quite robust across these distributions and alternative assumptions. And then obviously the future projections are subject to great uncertainty. They were quite simplistic because we modified incarceration rates in isolation from other things that, in a causal diagram are upstream or downstream of incarceration prevalence. But we do believe that they underscore the results from the future projections underscore the promise of incarceration-related interventions to accelerate TB progress. Okay, so some conclusions. To date, we've really failed to recognize the extent to which mass incarceration has generated an outsized excess burden of TB. And due to a lot of these methods that have kind of overlooked the dynamic nature of incarceration, we've really under-recognized incarceration as one of the leading drivers, if not the leading driver, in a lot of these countries. And yeah, again, policies to reduce exposure to incarceration, either by reducing entries into prison or by reducing the length of incarceration, have the potential to reduce population TB burden. I'm seeing that we're short on time, so I am gonna breeze through these recommendations and acknowledge my advisor and collaborators and colleagues, everyone who contributed to this project. My email is here, so feel free to reach out if you have other questions, but I did want to leave a couple minutes for questions. Sorry for taking so long, Finn.
That's quite all right. Thank you. It was really, really interesting and nice to go into a lot of detail with that. Really well done. It's such interesting work. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. I'm going to go with one quickly first, if that's all right, which was that I was particularly trying to think about the age element. So you mentioned you looked at age over 15 only, and what I was trying to work out was what the repercussions are for your population attributable fraction. And I was trying to work out if that means you've potentially underestimated it or overestimated it. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that compared to how the other, because it's a really striking plot when you compare it to other things like undernutrition and HIV and so on.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've thought a little bit about this as well. I will note that some of the path estimates from the WHO for the other risk factors, some of those were also restricted to the population over 15 or 18, like alcohol or smoking, for example, or even diabetes, I think. But yeah, I think it's difficult to know. I would say that, obviously there's the chance that there could be onward transmission of infections, of prison-acquired infections to the population under 15. I don't know what the degree of that is because of limited data, but I do think maybe if we were to account for the entire population, the path estimates would decrease slightly. Because probably I would assume that the population under 15 is not as affected by incarceration.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess we have to weigh that up against, your very thin strip of brown, which was people outside of prisons who were, so hard to know. I'm going to have I've got Pete, Lara, and I've just noticed Kristen asked a question in the chat as well. I don't know, Kristen, if you want to ask it yourself, and then we can go to Pete and then Lara.
Sure. Thanks, Vin. So this was way back when you were showing some of the initial data about TB cases in prisons, and I'm just curious. You showed these really dramatic increases in the countries that you were focused on in Latin America, and I'm wondering kind of sort of what your sense is of the quality of that data, and also the extent to which ascertainment or testing policies may have changed over time. Yeah, and just maybe a broader question about sort of the quality of that data. It sounds like you're fitting some of your models to the ascertainment of those cases in prisons.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. I mean, those data are kind of notified cases on data on notified cases, and we do think that, at least based on our experience directly empirically in Brazil, we think that there's there's a high accuracy of reporting of cases that are notified and diagnosed and started on treatment within prisons. In terms of changes over time, it's possible that the diagnosis rates have improved within prisons over time, and we did include that in our model. I will say, obviously, our model is simplistic, but in some of these countries where the notification rates increased over time, we tried our best to replicate those increases simply by increasing the diagnosis rate. But what we saw was that actually had an effect on the incidence that made it impossible to fit to those increasing notification rates without also increasing the effective contact rate. So we think that even if diagnosis rates have kind of improved in prisons over time, there's likely a combined effect as well of increasing incidence that's underlying that increasing trend. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thanks.
Thank you. Pete, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. And compliments on an exceptionally clearly presented talk. That was great. So I had two questions. I mean, the one was in your kind of preliminary thing, you had the South America, well, the Americas region as the only WHO region where TB was increasing, and you talked a lot about the kind of proportion of TB in each country, which was attributable to incarceration. I just wondered if you'd quantified what proportion of the increase in the Americas is potentially due to incarceration, since that was an upward trend.
Yeah.
And the second question, because I have to kind of duck out, is it feels like this could be an optimum length of stay in prison from the perspective of making TB transmission bad. Like if you're there a long time, you're very high risk, but presumably to achieve a given level of incarceration, you get lower turnover into the rest of the population. Whereas, conversely, you could send the whole population through very rapidly and they don't really get a lot of exposure. And I just wondered if you'd done any thinking about that.
Yeah, great questions. To your first question, we haven't directly quantified the percent of the increase that's attributable to incarceration, but that's a great suggestion. I'm sure you're aware of the paper by, I think, Nick Menzies and Ted Cohen on Brazil specifically, where they looked at the increase from 2015 to 2019 and found that like one of the largest explainers of that, I think it was Lancet Global Health, one of the largest explainers of that was the rates among incarcerated individuals. So I do think, at least in Brazil, it accounts for a lot of the increase. But we haven't directly quantified that. That's a great suggestion. To your second question about length of incarceration, yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that, you know, we do see in Brazil quite a high incidence rate within prisons, as well as a lot of spillover outside of prisons. And the duration of incarceration in Brazil was only, the average duration is only about 1.3 years. So we do think that even kind of shorter exposures would be sufficient to kind of create this high risk. In empirical studies that my advisor and our collaborators in Brazil have done, they found that they estimate that the annual risk of TST conversion in prison is about 25%. So it's really, really high rate of infection, really, really high force of infection, even within a year. But
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it certainly has implications also as, you know, countries change incarceration policies. I think it has implications about where we'll need to target also a lot of the biomedical interventions to identify and treat cases that are attributable to prisons. Thanks.
Thanks. And then Lara, maybe one last question. So I know we're already going over time. So
Yes, hi, Yiran. No, we're set to talk in a couple of weeks, but just very quick question. I know you said, I think you said you one of the calibration targets were the notifications, but and also at the beginning of the presentation, you say that actually notifications in prisons are much lower compared to the general population. So I just want to know how you took this mismatch into account, because I know you don't have notifications as a like compartment in your model. So what was the reason? How did you manage that?
Yeah, we were able to track notifications, which we basically tracked as transitions from active TB to recovered that were not just self-cure. So we were able to kind of track the rate of that over time. And in order to fit to notifications data, essentially we kept track of that rate. And regarding your comment about the disparity in case detection in prisons versus outside, we did allow the diagnosis rate in prison to be different from the diagnosis rate outside prison. So, you know, we used incidence estimates from a recent global burden paper on the burden of TB in prisons as well, to try to get at the ratio of notified cases in prisons versus total cases in prisons. Obviously, those estimates are themselves highly uncertain, which is why we sampled from a wide uncertainty distribution when we were calibrating to that data target. But yeah, that's how we fit to those data.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we had better close there, but thank you so much again, Yiran. That was really good. And I'm busy writing you a long email with my extra questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, Finn, and for everyone for your great questions and attention.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining. We'll hopefully see you in a month's time. We're going to be hearing from Joshua Havamaki, who's going to be talking to us about spatial targeting, I think it is, but I'll send an email out in the coming couple of weeks. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your Thursday and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.